Hello, it's me again with an excerpt from A Catalogue of Catastrophe, proving that living happily ever after is not as easy as you would think. My only excuse is that I was left unsupervised. Leon had driven Matthew to St Mary's, the weather was too bad for me to venture outside, and I decided, just for once, that I would shoulder my share of the culinary chores. I'd barely even made a cup of tea since we'd arrived at the cottage. Apparently, the drugs I was taking precluded me making any important decisions or operating heavy machinery, but I think they meant JCBs and high-speed trains and combine harvesters, not saucepans, obviously. Soup, I thought. It was Friday, and every Friday, Leon would make a delicious and nutritious soup from whatever was left in the vegetable rack. I could do the same. Okay, I reached for a chopping board, chopped like a maniac, staunched the bleeding more or less successfully, added masses of stuff from packets and jars and left it all to simmer. 1 hour later, I whipped off the lid. I know I always bang on about not eating green food because it's bad for you, but trust me, grey food is considerably worse. I'd never seen anything like it. Perhaps it tasted better than it looked. I cracked the crust, took a cautious sip and gagged, literally gagged. It was much better looking than it tasted. I tried to tip it down the sink and it didn't want to go. It clung to the saucepan with both hands and I had a bit of a struggle to get it out, at the end of which the sink was blocked. Okay, don't panic. I had half an hour before Leon was due home. Think, Maxwell. Bleach. I found it under the sink and poured half a bottle down the plug hole. Nothing happened. What else could I do? Boiling water can unblock sinks. I poured in an entire kettle full. Nothing happened, except now I had a sink full of grey, greasy, bleachy smelling water. Refusing to be beaten, I poked about a bit with some sort of skewer. Nothing happened. I toyed briefly with the idea of unscrewing the U-bend, but given the quality of my performance so far, it didn't seem the wisest course of action. I could picture some grey, amorphous mass crouching in the bend, just waiting to hurl itself at my face. So in the end, I decided to leave it. There was an excellent chance the stuff would just seep away on its own. The saucepan could not be saved. No more need be said. And anyway, I couldn't waste any more time because Leon would be home any minute now. Toast was well within my repertoire. I was Mrs. Mac trained, and I could make it special by sticking some cheese on it. Cheese on toast would be lovely on this chilly day. Leon would open the door to a smiling wife and the delicious smell of toasted cheese. I switched on the grill, grated every piece of cheese in the house, and lightly toasted a couple of slices of bread. Very carefully, I arranged the cheese on the bread right up to the corner so there would be no burnt bits and shoved it all under the grill. A few minutes later, it dawned on me there was no appetizing smell of toasted cheese or sound of bubbling or any signs of life at all. I sighed. Culinarily speaking, I was not having a good morning. I eased out the grill to ascertain why nothing seemed to be happening, except I pulled it out too far and it came off the runners and it and the cheese on toast fell all over the floor. Bollocks. There was a hell of a lot more cheese on the floor than there had been on the toast, some sort of scientific principle coming into play, I suspected. Bloody science. I'd used up all the cheese, so I studied what was on the floor, which seemed perfectly clean, so I very carefully scraped up the best bits and sprinkled it back on the toast. Sadly, there was a hell of a lot less cheese on the bread this time round. I shoved it all under the grill again and looked for a sweeping brush because I had grated cheese between my toes and it's not a pleasant sensation. and by this time the kitchen wasn't looking quite as Leon had left it that morning. I swept up what cheese I could find and contemplated topping up the toast, but there was a fair bit of fluff and dust mixed in, so sadly I tossed it all in the bin, where it could talk to the saucepan. And then I had a brilliant idea. I could combine the 2 slices into a toasted sandwich. One sandwich with lots of cheese inside was much better than 2 slices with a tiny sprinkling of cheese every 2 inches or so. Impressed at my brilliance, I pulled out the grill, a lot more carefully this time, and once again, nothing had happened. There was heat, I could hear the fan going round, and I had 2 slices of slightly sparse but mostly uncooked cheese on toast. Bloody bollocking hell, had the grill packed up? No, I'd switched on the oven by mistake. In my defence, the 2 symbols are very similar and I wasn't wearing my specs, the ones that make me look both intelligent and sexy, although I suspected they'd have a bit of an uphill struggle today. I was actually baking the cheese on toast. Unfortunately, the whole thing was bloody hot, including the handle, and I dropped the tray again, and the hot cheese on toast fell on my feet. Obviously, it wasn't hot enough to be appetizing in any sort of way, but hot enough to burn. I threw the grill down one end of the kitchen and the toast down the other, and hopped to the sink to splash cold water on my poor, burned feet. And the sink was full of grey, greasy, bleachy water, still. And at that moment, the front door opened. Oh God, the man of the house was home, cold, hungry, wet, and wanting his lunch, no doubt. And he had a big bunch of yellow roses in his hand. My heart melted because the woman of the house had wrecked the kitchen and had cheese-related injuries to her feet. I honestly didn't know what to say to him. I met him in the kitchen doorway. Seriously, I said, divorce me now. Well, all right, he said amenably, if you say so, but can you tell me why? For the paperwork, I feel my solicitor will want something more than just my wife told me to. Wordlessly, I stepped aside so he could benefit from the full impact. There was a long silence, and then he said, quite mildly, I thought, did it look like this when I left this morning? Miserably, I shook my head. You've been cooking, haven't you? Miserably, I nodded. There was a bit more silence. How did it go? Miserably, I gestured. Leon stood in the doorway, surveyed the kitchen, surveyed me, a trifle tousled, and turned away. What? I said defensively, because we can't all be at home in the culinary world. Still with his back to me, he shook his head. I hobbled towards him, all right, slightly exaggerating my injuries, but I was going for sympathy here. Still without looking, he reached out and put his arms around me. I'm fine, I said bravely, absolutely fine. I could feel him shaking. Was he perhaps grieving for his lost saucepan, the one with its handle poking out of the bin? Quite honestly, I wouldn't have thought he'd have had them long enough to have bonded in any meaningful sort of way. Pulling himself together, he said somewhat unsteadily, one morning, I leave you for one morning. I burnt my feet making cheese on toast, I said piteously, shamelessly going for sympathy and understanding. He inquired what was happening with the sink. Soup, I said. He shook his head. Sometimes my heart just overflows with love for you, which wasn't at all the sort of response I'd been expecting. He picked his way across the kitchen floor, rummaged in a cupboard and found some sort of plunger the landlord had provided. I hadn't thought to look. A couple of vigorous thrusts, and he's very good at those, and the sink uttered a slimy sort of exhalation, and there was the smell of a 3-day dead goat giving up its final fart. All credit to Leon, he stood his ground, merely inquiring what had been in the soup. Green leaves, purple leaves, something knobbly with frondy bits, something aniseedy, something red, and a potato. Ah, he said, that would be the problem. The potato? He nodded gravely. Not the easiest vegetable in the rack. Oh, well, I'll know for the future, I suppose. He froze. You're going to do this again? Well, not immediately, obviously. We've run out of vegetables, bread and cheese. I think there are some eggs somewhere. Would you like a... No, he said quickly. I'll take you to lunch somewhere. Go and have a quick shower. I've had one. Sweetheart, you have cheese in your hair. When I came down, the kitchen looked more or less normal, and the goat fart smell had taken advantage of the wide open windows and pushed off. We had lunch at the pub. Leon insisted on soup and toasted cheese sandwich to give me something to aspire to, he said. We both enjoyed our lunch, and although I should say that while his heart might have been overflowing with love for me, he still stuck me with the bill. The end.